They are elected by you. I am elected by you. I am constrained as they are constrained by a system that our founders put in place.
The founders separated power because they knew it was the best way to protect our citizens.
They didn't want one person, one man to have all the power like a king.
We show by our work that free people can govern themselves.
You can't pay lip service to the Constitution without obeying it.
Keep your eye on the ball. Structure is destiny.
This is Necessary and Proper, the podcast of the Federalist Society's Article 1 initiative. All views expressed on this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the Federalist Society. Hello, this is Nate Kazmarek. Welcome to Necessary and Proper. Today we have a great guest with us, Professor David Schoenbrod, who is a trustee professor of law at New York Law School. David, how are you today?
I'm dandy, and I'm glad to be here.
Well, we're grateful that you're with us. David is regarded as an expert in the field of environmental law and many other policy subjects. He has previously worked at the Natural Resources Defense Council and has written extensively on a wide range of topics. His prior books include Breaking the Logjam, An Environmental Law for the 21st Century, Saving Our Environment from Washington, How Congress Grabs Power, Shirks Responsibility, and Shortchanges the People, Power Without Responsibility, How Congress Abuses the People Through Delegation, and Democracy by Decree, How the Courts Run Government. His most recent book was published last month and is titled D.C. Confidential, Inside the 5 Tricks of Washington, and we are certainly looking forward to talking about it today. David, I thought we'd start off by asking you a couple questions about your background. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your early career, what drove your interest in the law, in government, and environmental law?
Okay. When I was a college student, I got an internship with Senator Hubert Humphrey, the outstanding liberal flamethrower in the Senate. And I became really just captivated with government. And this was a time when people trusted government. 76% of voters in the early 1960s said they trusted the federal government to do the right thing. Today, only 19% do. That's really distressing. And in some ways, this book is about what's changed, what has brought about this distrust of government, which I believe is deserved.
Mm-hmm. So you worked in the Senate? Is that what you said?
Yes, for Senator Humphrey, then Vice President Humphrey.
Of course.
And then I ended up working in an anti-poverty organization set up by Senator Robert Kennedy in New York. And there I was directed to work on what in essence were environmental problems in this poor neighborhood, problems like garbage and lead in gas and lead in paint. And so when some friends of mine set up this organization called the Natural Resources Defense Council, I ended up starting the litigation to get lead out of gasoline. And what I discovered in the course of that litigation was that Congress had promised to protect health from all pollutants by the end of the 1970s. This was in 1970 they made that promise, and it didn't happen. And because it didn't happen, and because they basically fled from responsibility, which is part of the tricks that I write about, about 50,000 additional children died. These were my clients. And because I was disgusted by the outcome, I decided I needed to go into academia and begin to understand what had gone so wrong with our government. And in some sense, the book I've just published is really my final report, my ultimate report on why our government does not serve us.
I see. So there's been sort of a natural progression over your career as you're exposed to these issues, as you've seen how government dysfunction affects real people. There's been a movement away from the work you did with the Natural Resources Defense to academia. And now, well, I guess you're still writing books about the environment, right?
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, the proximate cause of this present book was that I and some others got together because we believed the environmental statutes, which by and large were formulated in the 1970s, were badly obsolete and therefore imposed unnecessary burdens to clean up the environment, and as a result, the environment wasn't nearly as clean as it could be. I still believe in the goals of a clean environment, but I believe we should be doing it efficiently, and I believe the statutes that we have really impose unnecessary burdens and therefore produce a worse environment. So I and these others from the left and right proposed to Congress some changes in the environmental statutes that would produce more bang for the regulatory buck. And what members of Congress from the right and left said is, gee, I wish these changes were on the statute books, but you know, my colleagues in Congress just won't want to take responsibility for making changes. That's why that was the proximate cause for why I wrote this particular book. I wanted to write a book on the propensity of Congress and presidents to abdicate responsibility, to flee from responsibility, and that's what this book is about. You know, before I get into these specific tricks, I'd like to do this. I'd like to explain why it is that the tricks all began in the late 1960s. Okay?
Great.
And this is the answer. In the 60s, it seemed to us, and I remember this era, we thought the government was full of wonder workers. I mean, and for good reason. Our government had served us tremendously well. It had gotten us through the Great Depression, won World War II, invented the atomic bomb, built the interstate highway system, which didn't exist previously, and was now in charge of the world's strongest economy by far. So if we had a government that could do all this good stuff, why not have it do more, like stop pollution or set up Medicare or whatever the heck it is, right?
Sure.
And so that's what we asked for. But of course, we didn't want to pay a lot for these things either. So our representatives tried to oblige us, understandably so. And for reasons that, as I could explain, were pretty innocent, initially anyway, they tried to give us something for very little. It just didn't work out. It turned out, I mean, they just thought the economy was going to grow like topsy. It grew, but not that fast, which is why we're running into a problem where there's just going to have to be some pretty substantial tax increases and spending cuts down the road. So that's where the change came from. Over-optimism. We're suffering now we're victims of our own hubris, or rather the hubris of the generations that were in charge in the 60s.
But you've written a book about it, so obviously you remain hopeful about solving these issues, right?
I think we can. I think, and there are two basic reasons why I'm hopeful we can solve the problem. First of all, the American people are disgusted with Washington. That's where Drain the Swamp comes from. That's why Bernie Sanders, another outsider like Trump, that's why he did better than expected. People don't like the system. Number two, I think that most members of Congress are unhappy with the current situation. Nobody likes to wake up in the morning and look in the mirror and saying, I'm going to work in the most despised institution in America. I mean, that has to feel terrible.
Sure. So what is it, that they come to D.C. and there's a system already in place and they get swept up in it? Or?
Yes, and I was talking to the head of a very major bipartisan organization in town. He's neither left nor right. And he said he agrees with me. He said these younger members of Congress, the freshwomen, come to town and they don't even know the tricks are going on. They just think that's how government is supposed to work. It didn't work that way half a century ago. That's how it works now. And then once they get to be part of the system, they believe that unless I keep on playing the tricks, then I won't be elected and somebody worse than me will be playing tricks. So it's better that our side win. I mean, that's human nature, right?
Sure.
So we're basically trapped. And the answer to the problem is not to hate the players, but to hate the game, to change the game. So the Honest Deal Act is designed to change the game, to put all sides, left and right, subject to new rules that cut out the garbage.
Okay, and in your view, does the quote-unquote average American citizen have a role to play in this?
Absolutely. We need to tell members of Congress, our representatives in Congress, that we want an honest deal because they believe we all want something for nothing. And they could do that quite simply by going to the website for my book, www.dfacts, dc-confidential.org, dc-confidential.org, and there's a button there called Action, and they push that button, and they'll have a tool that will, within a few minutes, let them write their representatives in Congress and say that they want an honest deal, and another button that'll let them send emails to their friends saying, I've done this, please do it too. And I don't think it'll take that many of us to begin to roll the ball the right direction, and once it starts rolling, I think it's downhill.
Excellent. And that website is a companion to this book. Is there other information or tools available there for people to learn more?
Oh, yeah. On that site under games are online games that are kind of fun to play. You'd like to play them. And they're entertaining. People tell me they're entertaining. And it'll inform you about how the tricks work and how the Honest Deal Act will stop them. And there's also some pretty neat cartoons. So I'd suggest going to that website, www.dc-confidential.org.
Sounds like you've given that out a little bit in the last month or so.
I've done about 75 radio interviews in the last month or so, and keep adding 2 or 3 more every day. So
you're getting good at it.
I'm learning.
At the outset, I was impressed that you received forewords for the book from Governor Howard Dean and also Senator Mike Lee. Why do you think this book interested them, and why do you think that you have their support?
Well, this is not a book about left versus right. This is a book about honesty versus dishonesty. And I believe that when I went to work in Congress in the early 60s, most members of Congress wanted to be honest brokers, honest representatives of their constituents. And, I don't think that's changed. It's like that what's going on is that our current politicians are trapped in a dishonest system. We're all trapped in a dishonest system. Let me try to identify what I think the dishonesty is about.
Sure, please do.
Voters know that politicians are tricksters. So the question is how do they get away with it? And the answer is for the same reason that magicians can seem to pull rabbits out of hats. People don't see the sleights of hand, even though we know tricks are going on. So what the book is about are the sleights of hand that allow these tricks to fool us. And the sleights of hand come from a new system for enacting spending programs and other laws that allows the politicians to promise us the best of everything, but avoid blame, to shift blame for the bad consequences. And that's why government's crummy. That's why the approval rating of the federal government has gone from 76% to 19%. And that's why people like Senator Mike Lee and Governor Howard Dean are basically supportive of what I'm trying to do.
So let's talk about the book a little more in terms of the specific format. You identify 5 specific tricks. Would you like to talk about any of them?
Sure. Let's talk about the money trick. We all know the money trick goes on. Congress promises us medical care or tax cuts or whatever, but doesn't pay for them. It leaves the cost to some future Congress. And so it's like we're taking out a loan that we're going to have to pay for later on. Now, if we were taking it out from a bank, the bank would have to give us a piece of paper under the Truth in Lending Act that tells us exactly how much we're going to have to pay. And if the banker doesn't do that, the banker goes to jail. Mm-hmm. Congress does not require the same of itself. Okay. But the Congress is very specific about the benefits we're getting. We get a letter saying what our Social Security check is going to be when we retire. We don't get a letter saying this is how much we're going to have to increase the cost per average family in terms of tax increases or spending cuts in order to pay this thing off. So that's the sleight of hand. And my fix to the sleight of hand in my proposal, I have a proposal called the Honest Deal Act that stops all the tricks. My fix for this trick is to require the government to every year give us that letter that says, number one, the cost to the average family per year in terms of tax increases or spending cuts. Number two, how much has the current Congress increased or decreased that cost? Number three, if Congress continues to postpone imposing that cost, how much greater will it be? which will show us that if they keep kicking the can down the road, there's going to be draconian tax increases and spending cuts, which jeopardize our Medicare, our Social Security, and the livelihood of our children and grandchildren. This will make them accountable. This will keep them, the politicians, from shifting blame to the future. And it's also going to make them honest, but it's going to make us honest too, because we're then going to have to ask ourselves the question, when we're demanding something from government, are we willing to pay for it?
So that really is the great thing about this book. It not only highlights the tricks or the problems, but it also offers the solutions, right? Which you've labeled the Honest Deal Act, right?
Exactly.
And that Honest Deal Act addresses all 5 of them. Why don't you talk a little bit more about one of the other tricks? We've got the money trick, the debt guarantee trick, the federal mandate trick, the regulation trick, and the war trick.
Okay.
You don't have to cover them all, but anyone you'd be interested in sharing. Of course, we want people to buy the book and read about it for themselves as well.
And it's only $3 a trick.
Why don't you talk a little bit about the regulation trick?
Sure. Let's think about how regulation is supposed to work under Article 1. Article 1 assigns responsibility for regulation to Congress. If Congress enacts the rules of regulation, then Congress is responsible, politically responsible, for the regulatory protection granted and the burdens imposed. Now, around 1900, the progressives called for a different system, one in which broad authority was given to expert administrative agencies. That ended up giving credit for the benefits of regulation and blame for the burdens to the agency. Now, that system is problematic under the Constitution, but in any event, it usually led to balanced decisions because the regulators had their own reasons for wanting to be reasonably responsible. But then something new and different and bizarre and bad happened around 1970. What happened there is Congress figured out a way of taking credit for the benefits of regulation and shifting blame for the burdens. And the way it did that was to enact supposedly ironclad rights to regulatory protection and told the agencies to impose the burdens, the duties needed to deliver on those rights. Now, what happened was that the burdens turned out to be pretty big because Congress was pretty fulsome in the protection that it promised. Mm-hmm. And, for example, as I was mentioning before, clean air, completely healthy air by the end of the 70s. Well, it turned out to do that, you'd have to take 2/3, 3/4 of the cars off the road in Southern California. That wasn't going to happen. So quietly, members of Congress said to the agency, don't do it. Then when the agency didn't do it, they blamed the agency for not fulfilling the rights promised in the statute. This is a regulatory shell game. Okay? That's the regulation trick. And that's the sleight of hand that makes it go. Promise rights in statutes, make the rights judicially enforceable, but make the agency deliver or impose the burdens. And I have a fix for that in the Honest Deal Act, which is to make Congress vote on the major regulatory changes, whether to increase or decrease the regulatory protection. That way, Congress once again will be responsible for both the benefits and the burdens, and that's how it should be.
Well, that's how the founders intended.
Exactly.
Why don't you talk about a little bit, if you would, about the war trick?
Right. The war trick, in some ways, is the most disturbing of all because it affects the people that we send off in uniform to risk their lives in defense of our country. For the first 160 years of our Constitution, we didn't go to war unless not only the President as Commander-in-Chief ordered it, but Congress approved either by declaring war or more commonly by passing a statute specifically authorizing the war. That changed in 1950 when President Truman sent troops into Korea on the premise that that was just a
police action, right?
A police action,
right, in
which 33,000 American soldiers died. Now, the unpopularity of that, combined with the unpopularity of some of the combat in Southeast Asia, led to the passage of the War Powers Resolution, which was supposed to bring us back to where things had been before, where the president couldn't continue a war unless approved by Congress.
Right.
However, it turns out there's a loophole in the statute, and both presidents and members of Congress collude to use the loophole so that Congress need not either approve or disapprove controversial wars. And the reason Congress wants to avoid having that power is they don't know how the people are going to feel about the war at the end of it. So if they don't vote, then if the war turns out to be popular, they could march in the victory parade. And if it turns out to be unpopular, they could put the entire blame on the president. Mm-hmm. So here we have our soldiers being sent off to war, and then there's fights between the president and the Congress about who's responsible. And Congress, like, for example, with Libya, members of Congress said, yes, go in and bomb Libya, but don't make us vote on it. And when Obama did that, they criticized Obama for violating the War Powers Act. Right? So there's the sleight of hand. Congress has a statute, and it's supposed to make it responsible, so they could claim to be responsible. They could claim to want to be responsible, but yet avoid responsibility. That's really disgusting. Right?
Agreed. So what's the solution?
Well,
that you propose?
We could fix the loophole in the War Powers Act, and Joseph Biden, as senator, said Congress could do that, but members of Congress don't have the nerve to take responsibility. So we got to help them get the nerve, because if we tell them we want them to be responsible, they're not going to have the nerve to fight the Honest Deal Act.
So this Honest Deal Act really requires citizens really reaching out to members of Congress in order to give them the gumption, right?
Absolutely. But as I say, I think that they have their own reasons, many of them, to want to actually be responsible actors. And I think there are other political actors who have a stake in the Honest Deal Act. Governors and mayors are on the blame end, on the end of blame shifting. They're the ones who have to take the blame for for federal mandates. Presidents want to get things done. Presidents want to do things like drain the swamp, right? And what keeps the water in the swamp? The tricks, right? If you really want to drain the swamp, we're going to have to stop the tricks. Now, whether the incumbent President Trump is going to call for that or not, I don't know. But someday I think we're going to have somebody who runs for president on the platform of stop the tricks.
I want to ask you about one of the things you mentioned in the book that kind of struck me. You talk about what we can learn from honeybees, what they have to teach us. I'm curious if you might explain that and how it relates to openness and discourse.
Okay. The reason I bring up honeybees is that honeybees decide how to pick first off, the backup. When honeybees are doing well in the wild, it makes sense for the hive to divide. So you got the old hive where most of the bees are staying behind, but about 10,000 bees go off with the queen to find a new hive. So that's basically more honeybees. That's how the species grows. Right? Mm-hmm. They have to find a new place. And if they don't find a new place to put their hive, they're going to die. It needs to be high enough up with a small enough entry that the raccoons can't get in. It needs to be big enough to store enough honey for the winter. And there's a lot of other requirements, okay? So how do they find the hive? Well, it can't be that the queen goes off in search, because if the queen dies, the new hive dies. The queen is essential to the hive survival. Mm-hmm. So there's basically about a couple of hundred bees that go off as scouts. You could think about it as kind of a congress, right? And now there's not enough time before the hive starves to death for all these bees to visit all the potential sites, and there are hundreds of sites within range. So they basically use a system where the scouts go out and come back and they basically debate about which site is more promising, and the debate influences where the scouts are going to go. And the whole idea here is there's an open debate among the bees that determines where they're going to put their new hive. And it's illustrative of why the framers built a constitution that depended upon open debate. And to make the Constitution work, that system work, we need not only to elect the members of Congress, because they're our scouts, but also they have to be responsible for the consequences to us. I mean, that's the equivalent of survival. And what we've lost through these tricks is accountability to us. That's why our hive, the United States of America, is starving, is dying, because we have a government that doesn't serve us.
Very good. I just wanted to demonstrate that I read the book, and I enjoyed that illustration very much. I know I'm bouncing around a little bit, but
I'm going to interrupt you right there. There's
sure.
another illustration in the same chapter that I really like.
Okay.
And it's about the effects of not having a system of rules, a system of law. And if we have a system of law where we trust the decision-making process to be fair, then we're willing to go along with the outcome, even though not every decision is the decision we want. But where we have a system where we feel that others are cheating, then we all grab for what we can get. And so
That's
I
human
think,
nature.
Yeah. And I have an illustration there of in a railroad station in New York where there was a time when there was a lot of space and people just naturally lined up fairly. They got in line, right? Mm-hmm. I was there this morning coming down here. It's crowded now. People that can't see where the line is, or at least they can pretend not to see the line. So they get in there and they're elbowing their way through to get to the front of the line. They're acting like creeps, right? Mm-hmm. And so it was how we structure things is so important to people treating each other decently. And one of the bad effects of the tricks is not only do we distrust government for good reason, but we act like pigs. We're all grabbing for what we can get. So you could blame K Street partly on the tricks.
As you know, the Article 1 initiative is focused upon discussing and coming up with new ways to get Congress to fulfill its constitutional role. And certainly there's a lot of those ideas in your book. But I wanted to step back for a minute and just ask you, in your view, why is Congress so important to our society and our constitutional structure?
Okay. We're supposed to have a republic, and the foundation of the republic is Congress. The framers thought of Republican form of government being based upon the election of Congress, not the election of the president. So the Congress is the cornerstone of our republic. And for the republic to work, we need not only the ability to elect the members of Congress, but for members of Congress to be responsible for consequences. Otherwise, the elections are meaningless.
Beyond the Honest Deal Act, do you have other general recommendations that you'd like to see implemented in Congress? If we gave you the magic wand to make revisions, how would you change it?
I would say this, that what allowed our government to act as a republic, to avoid the tricks for a century and a half after the framing, was not the Supreme Court, but rather a set of expectations that Congress would be responsible. And that's what we have to bring back to life. So in other words,
the expectations that Congress adhered to on its own?
Yes, it did. It did. I mean, we did not.
They didn't look to the other branches to assert.
No, these tricks, the tricks I'm talking about, which are so fundamental and they affect every aspect of government, they didn't exist until the mid-20th century. And many of them are clearly not unconstitutional. I mean, arguably, and I've certainly tried, I tried to establish an argument about the unconstitutionality of delegation, and it went up to the Supreme Court in the American trucking case. It lost. Other than that, and perhaps some aspect of the federal mandate trick, it's hard to establish a judicially enforceable right that would stop the tricks. And I don't think, as a practical matter, the Supreme Court is going to do much about delegation or much about federal mandates. So, they've done a little bit on federal mandates with the Sebelius decision, but in general, not. This is going to have to come from the people, but it worked coming from the people, from the expectations of the people, for a century and a half, and we could bring it back. We need a new tradition for our time. We had a tradition that worked for a century and a half plus. We can't bring the past back. But if we rediscover what a republic is about and begin to insist upon it, then we could have a republic once again.
Excellent. I wanted to ask you, just in closing, the book is dedicated to some of your mentors, John Doerr, Neil D. Peterson, and Judge Spotswood W. Robinson III. I just was curious for your thoughts about them and why you decided to dedicate the book to them.
Okay. Let me, first of all, start by saying who they are.
Sure.
Neil Peterson was a poor young man from Minnesota who worked his way through law school as a chicken farmer, ultimately got a job with Hubert Humphrey, and he was my boss on Hubert Humphrey's staff, and I went to work for him when I was 19. And I've remained friends with him down through the years until he died. Then Judge Robinson was a lawyer for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and represented them in the Inc. Fund in the Brown versus Board of Education case, and helped to argue Brown in the Supreme Court along with Thurgood Marshall, and he was the judge I clerked for. And then John Doerr was the head of the Civil Rights Division under Kennedy, and he was the one who went to when he was trying to get James Meredith into the University of Mississippi, and the governor said, "Who are you?" And John said, "I am the law." They were all great men, obviously. And what they taught me about was professionalism and courage. And I felt that in writing this book, it took some courage because it's such a big topic. I was writing about things I hadn't dealt with in the past. And I had to believe that I could actually take on a topic of monumental importance and contribute something to it. And time will tell whether I've moved the ball forward an inch or not at all. But their example helped to give me the grit to carry forward. And I would mention further that, as you know, I'm going to be giving a talk about the book tomorrow in Congress, and Neil Peterson's widow, Deanna Freer Peterson, will be there, and that means the world to me.
How wonderful. Again, the book is D.C. Confidential, Inside the 5 Tricks to Washington. On behalf of the Federalist Society's Article 1 initiative, I want to thank you, David, for joining us today.
It was a pleasure.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please tell a friend, and don't forget to subscribe on iTunes or Google Play. To learn more about the Article 1 initiative, please visit fedsoc.org/Article I. That's fedsoc.org/Article I.
This has been a FedSoc audio production.